Welcome to the Little Sparks Podcast, your home for all things faith and music. I'm Cecilia.
And I'm Tara.
And we're former college roommates, professional musicians, and co-founders of the Hildegard Collective, a space for Catholic musicians to connect with one another and grow in their faith and profession. This podcast is an outreach of the collective, so if you're interested at all in Catholicism, music, or both, this is the podcast for you. Join us each week as we get real, share stories, and learn from other awesome Catholic musicians. We're all little sparks of God's divine creation, so together, let's ignite the world for Christ.
Welcome back, everybody, to episode 2 of season 5 of the Little Sparks podcast. Today, we are going to be bringing you an episode that is all about the virtues. Episode 1, if you watched it or listened to it, it was all about moral theology for musicians. Why moral theology is important for us to study and kind of have a general awareness of as a sort of general practice in life, but specifically for the lives of musicians. And so on the back of that, we wanted to come and talk about the virtues, given that they kind of form the foundation and basis of what moral theology is, and discuss some of the ways that the virtues are important and practical to the life of a musician.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this episode. I think it's going to be really great. The virtues they're not just a Catholic thing, not just like a Catholic kind of invention, so to speak. They actually, back in the ancient world, the ancient Greeks believed in the virtues and identified 4 virtues that we actually know as the cardinal virtues today. Cardinal coming from the word that means to hinge upon. So like everything in the moral life hinges on these virtues. And the church actually teaches with these virtues that anybody can obtain them, and you don't actually have to even believe in God to obtain these virtues. There are other virtues that are totally gifts from God, and we'll get into those in a little bit here, but it's just really interesting that, just as how they're through reason alone, we can reach knowledge of God. It also, through reason, we can reach good and honorable ways to act. And one cool thing with the virtues that I remember actually learning back in my first college philosophy class, which was all the classics, Aristotle and all of that, was that virtues really are good habits. And I just think that's really interesting, because sometimes I think when we're presented with the idea of the virtues, growing up in religious education or CCD, the virtues aren't always presented that way. And so I think that's just a really good tangible way to think about the virtues as good habits,
Yeah, totally. There was something. And now I'm many, many, many years removed from this, so I won't be able to remember exactly what it is, just to caveat. But in my high school lunchroom, there was a quote painted on the wall that was about the cultivation of virtue as a habit.
Nice.
And I remember reading it pretty much every day that I was in that lunchroom. And so it's a shame that I don't remember what exactly the quote was. But yeah, it really struck me that the practice of virtue is not something that you just do as a once-off kind of action and then forget about. It's actually a habit that you build through repeated practice over time. And in different sets of circumstances, we're offered different opportunities and avenues and ways in which to learn about and navigate the kind of day-to-day implementation of these virtues. And it's actually, I think when you stop and think about it in kind of a big picture sort of way, it's kind of interesting to think about.
It is. It really is. I think it's a really helpful and practical way to think about it too, As we said in our last episode, moral theology is a very practical theology. It's very tangible because it has to do with our actions. And the virtues, being good habits, really lay the foundation for this. So very tangible, and very achievable, especially with God's grace. So, through this episode, we're going to be using the Catechism of the Catholic Church as a guideline for our definitions of the virtues. And to start things off, I thought that I would go ahead and read what the Catechism has to say on the virtues, period. So, it's in part 3 of the Catechism. Article 7 is the virtues, and so this is number 1803. They start off by quoting the last chapter of St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, and it's my favorite verse from the letter of Philippians, so this is really cool. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. A virtue is a habitual and firm disposition to do the good. It allows the person not only to perform good acts, but to give the best of himself. The virtuous person tends towards the good with all his sensory and spiritual powers. He pursues the good and chooses it in concrete actions. The goal of a virtuous life is to become like God. I just think that is just such a wonderful, wonderful summing up of virtue. And I think it's really cool that the Catechism talks about how when you're virtuous, you're going to be tending towards the good with not just, your soul, the spiritual powers, but your body too, sensory powers. I just think that's such a good reminder that we're not just souls, we're bodies as well. And so this is that, that tangible living out the Christian life is found, in the virtues.
Yeah, totally. And it's so easy, I think, like I 9 to 5, I'm working in a secular workplace environment, and there are so many moments throughout my day where I feel like it's very rarely in the moment, but usually at the end of the day, when I'm looking back at my day, I'm like, oh, I actually had a lot of like small opportunities throughout my day to have an awareness of these virtues and the opportunities that I'm being presented with to grow in them throughout my like work day. So all of us, no matter like what sort of environment we're working or studying in, or no matter where we're at in our lives and our jobs, we're all being presented with opportunities every single day to cultivate these habits of excellence and virtue.
I love that. I love that. And I like how you talked about it being small opportunities, because I was thinking about this recently, as we record this, Saint Teresa's feast day was just the other day. And what is she best known for? But her little way of holiness,
Yeah,
and
totally.
the whole little way is really just choosing to love in these little ordinary moments of your everyday. It's not about doing these big extraordinary acts. It's about, choosing to love Jesus in the way we act in the little moments. And that's how we build up virtue, really, is by choosing the good in the little moments. Because when we choose the good in the little moments, then when or if, a bigger moment that requires a little bit more courage, perhaps, to choose the good, we have built up these little good habits that allow us to more easily choose the good in those more difficult moments, so to speak.
Yeah, totally. And I think I've heard like that said a lot, kind of a similar analogy, like when I was growing up and stuff. I feel like especially I would hear people say, oh, well, like the more you choose the good and virtuous behaviors in these small moments and these small things, the easier it'll be when, you have some crisis situation in front of you in life and you have to like make the right decision. And I remember kind of thinking like, okay, you're being dramatic when I was growing up. But actually, if you think about it, like everything in life works this way. Like if you study any sort of degree at university, right? It's going to class every day and taking your exams and those pop quizzes that drive you absolutely nuts when you're in school. that force you to ingrain the material that you're learning into your mind, which then all culminates when you're sitting in a job interview and you're being asked questions about your skill set and your knowledge. And that kind of same structure, I guess, system, like
Mhm.
really does apply to so many facets of our lives. And so I think it's easy, because for a long time I would have identified that sort of mentality almost exclusively with the spiritual life,
Mhm.
and to think, well, like, come on, like I wasn't making an effort, I guess, to kind of extrapolate that and observe that in all these other facets and areas of my life. And so really, like, the spiritual life in that sense is really not that different than like our lived human experience in
Yeah.
like all these different ways. So really, like, the cultivation of virtue and the building of these habits, these good habits that we're striving to achieve, it's like actually really quite similar to the things that we all do on like a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be this like big, scary, overly spiritualized sort of thing. It's just living your life, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes sense too, I mean, God created us, right? He didn't just create our souls, like he designed our bodies, he designed our minds, you know. Good, authentic psychology will always point us towards God. And it makes so much sense because he made us body and soul, that things that help us psychologically, or like things that we ingrain psychologically would then impact this or impact the spiritual life or vice versa. You know what I mean? Like there's everything is so entwined and we tend to forget that in our world today. I think because everything is very compartmentalized and specialized
Mhm.
that it can be easy to forget that we are meant to be fully integrated humans,
Yeah.
body, mind, soul,
Yeah, totally. Um, and I think that's kind of the perfect segue to talk about some of the virtues and
Absolutely.
start discussing what they are and how they apply to our lives.
Yeah, so I think my first thought when we were going into this was to discuss perhaps the theological virtues first and then the cardinal virtues.
Hmm.
But as I was reading on the catechism, they actually flip it around. They study the cardinal virtues first and then go into the theological virtues. So perhaps we should go about it that way. What do you
Yeah,
say?
that sounds great. Let's do it.
All right. So, to start off, what the cardinal virtues are, there are four virtues. Like I said in the beginning, the word cardinal comes from a word that means to hinge. So, everything else hinges on these virtues. And there are actually sub virtues within each of these. And if we have time, we might talk about a couple of what some of those sub virtues look like. So the four cardinal virtues are as follows. There's prudence, there's justice, fortitude, and temperance. So we'll go into each of those and but before we do, I just want to quickly read the very opening paragraph from the Catechism on these human cardinal virtues because I think it's pretty important. So, number 1804, so right actually following the passage I just read a little bit ago. Human virtues are firm attitudes, stable dispositions, habitual perfections of intellect and will that govern our actions, order our passions, and guide our conduct according to reason and faith. They make possible ease, self mastery, and joy in leading a morally good life. The virtuous man is he who freely practices the good. The moral virtues are acquired by human effort. They are the fruit and seed of morally good acts. They dispose all the powers of the human being for communion with divine love.
That's a lot to unpack.
It is a lot to unpack, but I think, just a couple of quick takeaways from that, not to spend too much time on this so that we can really dive into these virtues. I think that in our last episode, we talked about how there is a difference between a morality of obligation versus a morality of happiness. And in a morality of
Mm.
obligation, you're just doing things because you feel like you have to do them. Whereas morality of happiness, you're doing things out of a free desire to want to do the good, you know?
Yeah,
Um, and here, they say the virtuous man is he who freely practices the good. And when the
yeah,
Catechism says man here, it's really referring to mankind, so all of us. So that's what it looks like to really be virtuous, is to freely practice the good. Um, and I also like how it notes at the end that it disposes all the powers of the human being for communion with divine love. So it helps us to be open to that love of God and to be able to receive it, which I think is so beautiful.
yeah, absolutely. And I think there was a list somewhere in that paragraph. Self-mastery, I know, was one of the
Yes.
things on that list, that these virtues kind of help us to cultivate in our lives. And
Yes.
I feel like these, for me, like when I think of the theological virtues, I think about how they inform my relationship with God.
Hmm.
And these cardinal virtues always, I think about them in terms of how they inform my relationship with mankind, with the people around me. And like, obviously, that's not a mutually exclusive distinction. Like, there's definitely overlap there. Obviously, the more you practice virtue in your relationships with people around you, the
Hmm.
stronger your relationship with God is going to become, and vice versa. Um,
Yeah.
so it's not an exhaustive kind of comparison, um, but I think it's helpful for understanding um, like the function of these virtues in our
Yeah,
lives.
absolutely. Absolutely. So on that note, shall we go right into these cardinal virtues?
Yes, and right away already there are things jumping out at me that I'm like, oh, I think musicians are really good at this one and need a lot of work on this other one. So
Yeah.
just obviously it's a very general statement.
Yeah, yeah. No, no, yeah, I agree. This will be fun to dive into.
Yeah, spill the tea.
So the first one of our cardinal virtues is prudence, which happens to actually be my favorite of all the cardinal virtues if I had to pick one. I really love the virtue of prudence. So the definition of prudence, according to the Catechism, is that prudence is the virtue that disposes practical reason to discern our true good in every circumstance and to choose the right means of achieving it. And St. Thomas Aquinas gives an even more succinct definition of that prudence is right reason in action. So it's being able to choose the right course of action and then to act on it.
Yeah.
That's what prudence is.
So what does that look like in terms of like the moral life?
So in terms of the moral life, gosh, I mean, so many examples immediately just come to mind. To think of one specifically that maybe musicians might come across, um, could honestly be in a rehearsal. Think of like a chamber music rehearsal when you're working with a small group of people, you don't have a conductor, and it's all up to, you as a group to contribute and to inform, how you're going to interpret this piece.
Yeah.
So, using the virtue of prudence at work here would look like, like let's say you're like trying to figure out this specific passage, using your reason and what you've learned about, the style of the piece, different articulations or whatnot, using your reason to come up with a course of action that the group could possibly take and then trying that out.
Yeah.
Like that would be an example, a very little example of prudence at work, honestly.
Yeah, totally. One that came to mind for me, obviously in an opera career, something that I'm always conscientious of that I've spoken about before on the podcast is like if I'm offered a role in an opera, determining the moral qualities, not only of that character,
Mhm.
but of the show as a whole, and like um, what am I contributing my time and my energy and my voice towards? Is it something that has a positive moral outcome that I would be proud to stand behind? Or is it something that maybe there's some messaging in there that like I don't totally agree with? And having to use kind of my own discernment and prudence um, to look at those factors and at those details of the contract in front of me
Mhm.
and make a decision about whether or not I'm going to accept or if I'm going to try and negotiate something in the
Yeah,
role. Um, I feel like that's a big one for like singers for the
yeah,
most part.
absolutely. Absolutely. Another one popped into mind for teaching. If you're, let's say you're teaching a private lesson and you have a student who's, getting frustrated maybe perhaps in the middle of the lesson and maybe even breaks down in tears. I might be, drawing from personal experience here. But
What?
yeah, what prudence then would look like, examining the situation, you have a relationship with this student and using your prudence to determine what is the next best step here. Do we
Mhm.
stop the lesson and just like, take some time to calm down? Do we talk through this,
Yeah,
um, but just like using the individual circumstances at hand to make a decision then and
yeah,
on how to proceed with the fact that you have a crying 10-year-old on your
yeah.
hands you know
Yeah, for sure. And oh my gosh, music therapy. I feel like that's all
Mhm.
prudence. That's like all you do all day is like
Yeah.
come in and observe patients in whatever, form they might need care and they might need your therapeutic
Yeah,
skills and figure out what do I do with this? What sort of
absolutely.
activities do we do? What music do we work with? Like that whole career, your whole career is basically prudence.
Yeah, constantly having to put right reason into action, to
Mm,
just go back to Thomas Aquinas.
100%.
One cool thing with prudence before we go on to any of the other virtues is that it's actually the virtue that guides all of the other cardinal virtues. So, if you were to say that there was a most important cardinal virtue, it would be prudence.
That makes
Uh,
sense.
oh, yeah, for sure. To quote back to the Catechism, it is prudence that immediately guides the judgment of conscience. There we go.
Yeah.
uh, so, we need prudence in order to act out on these other virtues.
Yeah. There is a lot of overlap, I find. Like, um, again, we're gonna get into the rest of the virtues here in a second. But like if you are making a decision to be temperate or to act in justice, let's say,
Hmm.
those decisions are also prudent.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
there's
Absolutely.
a huge amount of overlap, I think, with prudence and like basically every other kind of virtue.
Yeah, absolutely. And one very, very quick fun fact, with the virtue of prudence, as I mentioned before, there are sub-virtues to the virtues. And one that I just want to quickly just highlight for prudence is that there is a sub-virtue of memory. And I think that's a very important one for musicians, considering how much we have to memorize.
For
So
sure. Oh my
just
gosh.
know that whenever you are memorizing a piece of music, you are actually like working on a virtue here. So,
Yeah, that's like actually benefiting your spiritual life, which is
yeah.
crazy. And when you think about it too, not to get like too like stuck on this, but um there are so many different tactics out there for memorization. I feel like it's such a common topic in like Facebook groups with musicians and stuff like that is like, guys, what are your techniques for, memorizing a lengthy role in an opera or a really difficult score and
Mhm.
people will be on there with like all these different answers of like, oh, I use post-it notes, I use a color coded highlighter system, like it's all of these different tactics and like, oh, I do my steps in order of ABC. And then someone else is like, no, 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 but I order my steps like XYZ, and that's what works for me. And
Yeah.
it's, I think it's just so cool to think about the fact that like all of these people in here talking about memorizing are actually talking about development of a virtue and all of their different techniques and the order in which they do things is also indicative of like the beautiful variety that exists in the spiritual life because they're all ultimately working towards the same goal. They're all cultivating the same like virtue, but they're
Exactly.
all just doing it differently, and it's just
Yes.
whatever works for that
It's so
individual.
cool.
Yeah, it's
It's
super
so
cool.
cool. And just to touch one more thing on this, with this sub virtue of memory, because we're integrated people, body, mind, soul, all of that good stuff. Um, as musicians, we have to focus a lot on memorizing in terms of music and roles and parts and all of that.
Mhm.
Um, to better integrate that then into our lives, how can we use memory then in regards with other people, whether it's, remembering names, remembering like, something from a conversation you had with someone and being able to bring that up, the next time you see them. Pope St. John Paul II apparently had a memory that was so good that he could look at someone and say, we met like 30 years ago, and they would be like, we did? When did we meet 30 years ago?
Oh
And he'd be like,
wow, yeah.
no, I remember. And he would like tell them exactly when it was and what they said to each other. So that's like an example of a really, really strong memory at
Wow,
play, like that virtue of
that's
being
amazing.
so developed. Um, but so that's just something, I think for food for thought. How can we take these like memorization skills that we have in music and then transfer them over to maybe like our personal lives or our
Yeah,
relationships with people?
there was a for anyone who's interested in this, there's a I watched it was a podcast a couple of
Hmm.
years ago, I want to say at this stage, um, with this guy from Australia who was like one of the national like memory champions. And it
Ooh.
was so interesting to listen to him talk about his like how he trained his mind to be able to do all of these crazy, like truly insane memorization tests. Like one of them was like they gave him like 100 different faces and names under each of the faces, and he had
Oh,
like a minute or like maybe a couple minutes to like look at all 100 of these and memorize them, and then they would like he would like they would to get rid of all the names, and he would have to like tell you the names of each person. I think he got like 90 some accurate or something like that, like.
that's wild. Oh my
And
God.
but it was so interesting because he talked about how like it all started for him with he started developing um just what you would think is like quite normal like memory issues as he was like aging and getting older, and he just was like, no, I'm going to be proactive about this. I have no interest in getting dementia. I have no interest in struggling with my cognitive function as I age. So I'm going to put the effort and the hard work in to train my brain to heal itself, basically. And he did. And he was really successful. So,
Oh, that's
yeah,
really cool.
it was really cool.
Wait, on that note, just before we move on to justice, because then we probably should move on to justice. Um, I remember when because my moral theology professor talked about, the virtue of memory when I took moral theology. And I wanted to actually highlight because you brought up, dementia and if for some reason you have some uh difficulty with memory, like that doesn't mean that you're not like virtuous in that area. You can do the best with what you have. I remember when I learned about this, was I suffering from a concussion at the time? No, but I had multiple concussions where it really affected my memory. So at first I was like, oh no, like, did this concussion like make me not virtuous in this area, but no, the answer is no.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
things that are outside of our control, and ultimately, suffering is part of the human experience, and it is something that we can offer to our Lord,
Yeah.
but we can do our best with, our memory in those cases. Or even just like if you have like mom brain, if you have kids, mom brain is a real thing, where it's very easy to forget about things. I'm already experiencing it with pregnancy. I haven't even given birth yet, and I'm already
Hmm.
suffering from mom brain.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so like there are these very real things that can affect our memory,
For
but that
sure,
doesn't
for sure.
mean that you can't grow in virtue in those ways in some way. And it also doesn't mean that you're not virtuous at all.
Yeah, yeah. But it
So
also doesn't mean that you have to settle in those areas either.
exactly,
Like this guy that I
exactly.
was talking about on the podcast is like he could have very easily said, "Oh, well, this is just the natural progression of my brain and as I age, like this is just going to happen naturally, so I'm just going to let it happen," and could have just sat back and um fallen into, cognitive decline as he got older. But
Mhm.
um he instead chose to like actually make a very concerted effort to say, I
Mhm.
am going to work to actually improve this and to grow in this area. And like that is virtuous behavior on his part. Not strictly because his memory got better, but because of the effort and the work that he put in to not be like lazy about the decline of that functionality.
Yeah, absolutely. So, do the best that you can in your life circumstances, and there you go.
That's all God asks.
Amen. So, to go on to justice, then, here's the definition of justice that the Catechism gives. So, justice is the moral virtue that consists in the constant and firm will to give their due to God and neighbor, which is a lot. I think it's very easy to look at the world around us and see a lot of injustice,
Mhm.
um, and a lot of unjust actions that happen. But justice is, very, very important. And it's a very important characteristic of God as well. Um, but one cool thing I do remember about justice from when I took moral theology and was learning, in depth about these virtues is that you can't have mercy without a really good understanding of what justice is. Mercy can't exist without justice. And justice also is, dependent on mercy as well,
Hmm.
which I thought was really interesting. So there's a very integral link between the two, and they're dependent on each other.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I think when you look at like political systems that exist,
Mm,
I think you can see a lot of people and intentions maybe that are rooted in something good but lack that true understanding of mercy and justice. And so they're skewed and they don't actually work in the way that they look like they would maybe on paper. Or,
I
yeah, I actually think it's interesting to consider because justice, I think, at least when I think about it, it's so linked in with our like civic life and with
yeah.
government and politics. And, every time you see a courthouse, they're always like the scales of justice is something we see everywhere when it
Yeah.
comes to law. And I think it's really interesting because as our Western society as a whole has made a concerted effort to write God out of the picture and to integrate things like separation of church and state and things like that. I think we see the effects of that really clearly in the fact that
Yeah.
people can have the best of intentions, politicians, people making laws, um, their hearts can very much be in the right place, but because they lack the true kind of virtuous understanding of what mercy and justice are,
Yeah.
it's gets pretty messy.
Oh, yeah. Oh my gosh, yeah. I think that we see the real-time consequences of that, in the amount of division
We're
that's,
living it. We're living
yeah,
the real-time consequences.
we are. We very much are. But, even like putting politics and all of that, our civic systems aside, in our personal lives and in our professional lives, there are many times when we can see instances of injustice, whether it's how someone is treated by someone, or even the way that we treat others, it's
Yeah.
something worth considering. Do we treat others with a sense of justice towards them, giving them what's due to them?
Hmm.
And with that, I think it's really important that we remember that every single person is made in God's image and likeness. And so when we speak of giving, due to our neighbor, there is a certain level of respect and reverence, even that our dignity demands as being made in God's image and likeness.
Yeah.
And our behavior sometimes may not reflect that dignity, but
Yeah.
that dignity is still always there because nothing that we can do can ever strip that dignity from us.
Yeah.
That is a God-given gift. And so I think that's really important to remember because sometimes it can be tempting, I think, to act, maybe harshly towards someone out of a sense of justice, but it might not necessarily be justice that's happening there
Yeah.
if we're acting harshly. So always remembering to treat others with respect and reverence. That doesn't mean that we can't, set boundaries or, put our foot down firmly about
Hmm.
something. But we can always do that with a sense of respect and reverence towards the
Yeah.
person that is in front of us.
I think sometimes we can be acting out of a sense of true justice, and we can even have a very right understanding of the situation at hand that we're dealing with.
Hmm.
But the devil can still tempt us further in our reaction to whatever justice we're trying to solve. So it's making sure that you are perceiving and understanding the situation correctly and then responding rightly to that as well. Because
Yeah.
it's St. Paul, I think, who says, like, without love, essentially our actions are all meaningless.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to give like one tangible example of how justice is or may not actually be played out in maybe a musician setting is favoritism. We see favoritism a lot
Hmm.
in the world of music, and that is not always just, you know.
Yeah.
So while we may not be able to necessarily do anything about situations where someone else is treating someone with favoritism, um, we can at least in our own what we deal with and what we get to dole out, so to speak, um, we can work to operate from a place of, you know, giving people their due and
Yeah.
not acting on favoritism. So like for example, if like, you're on an audition panel, like you're actually judging an audition and it's not a blind audition and you can see who's in front of you,
Hmm.
not picking, favorites and working really hard to look at the people in front of you as like almost like a blank slate, in
Yeah.
terms of
Yeah.
just judging based on performance and how they're doing instead of like, oh, well, I know that person.
Hmm.
So like I think that's an example right away where we can live out the virtue of justice as a musician.
Yeah. Oh boy, there are a lot of politics when it comes to the music world, unfortunately. Um,
Yes.
I also think justice is very closely linked with humility as well, which is something that
Mm-hmm.
we talk about a lot as musicians because the temptation to grow very prideful in seasons of
It's
success
so
is
real. It's so
very
real.
real. It's very real. Um, and also the temptation to maybe misunderstand humility and what it is. But it's very closely linked with justice, and that humility is understanding your correct place, and that you're not kind of artificially inflating your ego, and you're not allowing yourself to think you're better than you actually are, but you're
Yeah.
also not putting yourself down. That is also a very, very
Yes.
important part of the virtue of humility that often gets overshadowed by the latter, or the
Mhm.
former. um, so I think I think the cultivation of humility, true humility in musicians, is very closely linked to the practice of justice as well. And I think,
Absolutely.
Cecilia, like in the examples you were giving about like favoritism and stuff like that, like we've all been there, we've all experienced it. It's so unfortunate and it's so frustrating. And, you know, whether or not you're kind of on the receiving end of that favoritism, like it can it can be pretty disastrous and messy, like either way. And I think always
Yeah.
responding to situations like that with prayer is super important.
Very, very important. Absolutely. Well, on that note, going on to the third of the cardinal virtues, fortitude. We have fortitude here. So the Catechism says that fortitude is the moral virtue that ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in the pursuit of the good. It
Mm,
strengthens the resolve to resist temptations and to overcome obstacles in the moral life. Virtue is the virtue of fortitude is a hard one, I think.
yeah.
I think it's hard no matter what. I think it's especially hard in today's day and age. Um, but this is, I think the virtue of prudence really can come into play here with fortitude. Um, one thing about the virtues is that the virtues lie as the mean between two extremes. And so, with the virtue of fortitude, on one extreme, you have, you know, cowardliness.
Mm,
And that's very easy to see as like an opposite, of fortitude.
yeah.
But then on the other side, that the other extreme is actually recklessness.
Yeah.
So fortitude is not reckless. There is very much an active choosing of prudence in being able to be or practice this virtue of fortitude
Yeah.
when faced with decisions that require fortitude.
Yeah. I think that's such a good point. And I actually think when it comes to fortitude, I think this is the one that strikes me as I think musicians have the most potential to like thrive in this area, strictly
Hmm.
because like if you're pursuing music even at a collegiate level, you have worked your butt off to get where you are. It is, I mean, musicians face more rejection and unfortunate political circumstances like we were just talking about, um, favoritism and just all kinds of really craziness in one year than most people will face in their entire careers. And
Yeah.
I think that you really have to have a thick skin to even get to, you know, studying music at the collegiate level because
Yeah.
of that. And so I think that kind of primes you really well for being able to withstand a lot of negativity and a lot of difficulty and kind of stay strong in the face of trials. And so I think there's so much potential for musicians to really, really cultivate the virtue of fortitude. Um,
Absolutely.
but I also think it can be very easy to slip in some ways into that avenue of recklessness.
Yeah.
I think especially in college, because like college is just such a unique time in your life, and for
Hmm.
sure there are people around you making reckless decisions all the time when you're in college, and sometimes it's really hard to resist that temptation because it seems really fun, or it seems like you would have more friends, if you made these reckless decisions or whatever the case may be. Like I think you could very easily fall into the trap of recklessness, but at the
Gosh,
same
yes.
time I think like we all have good heads on our shoulders. We know how to be prudent in our decision making and
Mhm.
be very kind of steady in that drive towards true fortitude and not veering off to one side or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, you know, going back to the beginning of this episode where we talked a bit about, virtue really being cultivated in the little choices that we make.
Mm,
The virtue of fortitude is no exception to this. Um, so, you know, I mean, there are countless ways in which I think we can engage in choosing the virtue of fortitude in little ways in the life
mhm.
of a musician, whether it's, you're getting towards the end of a really long rehearsal and you're just mentally starting to check out,
Yeah.
and just choosing to exercise your will and engage in the present moment because you're almost there. It's almost over,
Mhm.
Uh, something like even as little as that can help you develop the virtue of fortitude and
Yeah,
enable you
totally.
to be able to then choose to practice the virtue of fortitude in maybe a more difficult circumstance.
Mm,
Like if you're presented with a moral situation in your workplace that may be difficult for you to
yeah.
navigate, and you know that you have to make a hard choice here.
Hmm.
Uh, like cultivating the virtue of fortitude in these little ways can actually really help you to be able to choose then the moral good in tough circumstances.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think you're 100% spot on about fortitude. Like, I think, I think while um, all of these cardinal virtues kind of hinge on prudence, I also think fortitude is required often to make a prudent decision,
Mm,
especially where it regards other people, and other people are either going to be affected by the decision you make or aware of the decision that you make. Sometimes
yeah.
it is not always an easy, simple choice to do the prudent thing, and um, it requires being okay with rejection, I think,
Yeah. You're
because
so right.
there are, unfortunately, often many people in our lives, in our families, our friends, our colleagues, who might not always understand or approve of certain decisions that we make because we know them to be morally correct. And
Mhm.
that can be really, really challenging. That can lead to a lot of challenging situations, to navigate a lot of really tough conversations. So I think working to kind of cultivate this virtue, as you said, Cecilia, like choosing to exercise your will to say, yes, this is difficult, this is really challenging, but I am going to be make a conscious effort to do the difficult but right thing. That's like so crucial.
Yes. And actually that really brings up a point that I wanted to make before we, finish anything on virtues, is that when you grow in one virtue, it actually affects the other virtues. You grow in the other virtues as well, and in sometimes mysterious ways, but the virtues are all integrated, We keep coming back to this theme of integration, I feel like, in this episode. But
Hmm.
the virtues themselves are all integrated. So when you grow in prudence, you're also growing in temperance and justice and fortitude.
Yeah.
When you're growing in fortitude, choosing to do the right thing in when it's hard, um, you're also exercising prudence and justice and temperance.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's really cool how they work together. And as you go about maybe more actively trying to pursue virtue in your life and make virtuous decisions, you can start to see how these are very much linked. And that's really cool to see. So, definitely keep an eye out for that.
Yeah. And speaking of integrations as well, like the more you integrate virtue into your life and work on becoming the holiest and best person that you can be, that also will inform your musicianship and the better like
Hmm.
musician you will become. Um, it's kind of a hard thing to phrase grammatically well, is something that I've learned from having to write down this theory
Yeah.
many times in emails, on our website copy. I've tried to put this into words a lot, and it's really hard to do well. But like in becoming the best version of yourself, you are also becoming the best musician that you're capable of being. And I think
Yes.
people talk about this all the time. And I feel like in college, this was used to justify a lot of really bad decisions. Is people would say, well, the more life experiences I have, the more material I can pull from as an artist to inform my work. And it's
And
like,
then use it to justify all kinds of like
yeah,
pretty simple things.
like crazy decisions. And I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
but is
Have life
this,
experiences without going out and actively choosing to sin.
yeah, but also,
A lot of life experience actually without actively going out and choosing to sin.
yeah, but also, like, is that the kind of life decision you want to be pulling from in your artistry? Like,
Yeah, that's fair. That is a
I
fair
mean,
point.
that's obviously a decision that's up to each individual person, but I know my answer to that question. Um, but I think it is true that the life experiences that you have and your perspective on different things does actually inform your ability to emote and
Mhm.
to kind of put music in its respective context.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that comes actually from striving to be like the best person that you could be and
Mm-hmm.
learning to develop the virtues and make a habit of good decision making.
Yeah. I feel like there's honestly like an entire conversation that we could go into with that, but for the sake of time, we probably should move
Not
on
on
to
this episode.
temperance.
Yeah.
So, the definition of the virtue of temperance is that temperance is the moral virtue that moderates the attraction of pleasures and provides balance in the use of created goods,
Mm.
ensures the will's mastery over instincts, and keeps desires within the limits of what is honorable. So, a lot of times people use the virtue of temperance to describe moderation in eating, for example, as a guide
Yeah.
against gluttony or
Mhm.
getting drunk. You know, within the life of a musician, that could look like moderating your practice time, not going overboard.
What a concept.
I went there, and maybe it's because I have injuries from practicing too much
Yeah.
and not exercising the virtue of temperance in this area of my life. But um but I think that's like, that's one area, for instance, or perhaps taking on too much at one time
Mm.
because we think, oh, it's for the sake of our career. But that doesn't mean that it's actually going to serve you in the long run.
Mhm.
It's, providing balance in the use of created goods, that's, you know, not necessarily going to help you be able to do that.
Yeah, yeah. The phrase that everyone uses, I feel like, is everything in moderation. And I
Yes.
think, particularly, I think when I was a student, I found this one really difficult because I felt like I was always getting criticized if I tried to exercise this virtue as it related to my music.
Mm,
I feel like so many people would like actually cast judgment on me and be like, "Oh my gosh, you only practiced for an hour today? Like that's disgusting behavior. What are you even doing here?" And like it's really hard to combat like the judgment of other people because
yeah.
like as you said, Cecilia, without the like exercising of this virtue, you can actually injure yourself and you can end up harming your career that you're striving so hard to build up. It's like it's
Yeah.
actually really important to use the virtue of temperance in our relationship with music. And yet, I feel like it is maybe the most looked down upon and discouraged
Yes.
as it
As
relates to music.
Yes. And I do like seeing that there is a growing movement among musicians to bring awareness to this and to, like, we need to be taking care of our bodies.
Hmm.
Um, but it's not seen as much as it should be. It's definitely probably miles better than from when, say, my parents were in music school, but it's still not where it should be.
Yeah.
And really, at the end of the day, temperance is about honoring the body that God gave you and
Hmm.
making good decisions in regards to that body. So then there you go. You have the virtue of prudence at play there.
Yeah.
You have the virtue of justice at play there. You have the virtue of fortitude at play there, even because it can be really hard
Hmm.
to, restrain ourselves, especially when it's something we're passionate about too.
Yeah.
So that's just something, to keep in mind as well.
I think for me, and like I don't have a hard and fast answer on this, but I've struggled a lot, I think, with this virtue as it relates to music and like what should my relationship with music look like? What is healthy for me? And where do I cross that line? I feel like it's for me it's super difficult to define where that line is, and it's shifted I think during different seasons of my life. Um, and one thing that I've always kind of thought is when I start losing my love for music and I start losing my passion that I have held in my heart so strongly for like literally decades of my life. When that starts fading and that starts going away, I know I have a serious problem and I
Mm,
am not being temperate with my time and my gifts and my talents and my work ethic.
yeah.
And I definitely have crossed that line a few times
Oh, yeah.
in my academic life and in my professional career where I thought, it's just, I don't even enjoy this anymore. This isn't even something I look forward to. This
Mhm.
isn't something I want to do. And that's really hard. But it's always a really good indicator for me of like, okay, we've gone too far. We've messed up. We need to rein it in and reorder this relationship because this is out of whack. Out of whack. This is like
Yeah,
this has become
absolutely.
disordered the way that I'm prioritizing this. And like I don't always have it's not always a quick fix. Sometimes
Mhm.
it's really challenging and really hard to figure out exactly where missteps are happening, misalignments in your relationship with your music. It can be really really hard and challenging to figure out exactly where you stand with some of that. But
Absolutely.
I think it's really important for like everything. I mean, your career, your health, your sanity, your spiritual life, um, maintaining the virtue of temperance. I think without this, so many things just kind of fall to bits, you know?
Absolutely. I think a lot of burnout can be prevented by exercising the virtue of temperance.
Mm,
But it reminds me of, there's a quote from Saint Irenaeus, who's one of the, early church fathers. He's a doctor of the church now. The glory of God is man fully alive. We were designed to be fully alive, and when we don't practice the virtue of temperance, it actually keeps us being fully alive. And then to go back, to the whole premise of virtue to begin with, virtue like enables us to freely choose the good, you know,
hmm.
and so when we're fully alive, we can freely choose the good. So I think that's just worth, keeping in mind.
For sure.
I feel like there's a lot more that we could go into on this, but just to touch on one last thing before we wrap up with the cardinal virtues is that as we've said before in this episode, the cardinal virtues are obtained through human effort. Like you don't even have to believe in God to have the cardinal virtues in your life. But that being said, grace does play a big part in the cardinal virtues in terms of we can grow a lot faster in virtue when we rely on the grace of God to help us.
Mm,
So, if you find yourself struggling in a particular area of virtue, just go to Jesus and ask him for his grace and he will help you. And just continually do that as you're practicing virtue and building up these good habits because he will come through, he will help
yeah,
you, and you will progress so much faster than you could on your own.
absolutely. And I think I think the same is true with your music. Like the more you invite God into your music and your growth and development as an artist, the like you'll be flying before you know it. Like
Absolutely.
just being able to do so much more than you ever could on your own.
Absolutely. It all goes back to integration, like
That's
living an
it.
integrated life, right? I love it.
Absolutely.
Well, we have been recording for about an hour at this point, which is wild. So I think that we're going to go ahead and make this episode actually into a two-part episode for the sake of everybody involved. So next week we'll be talking about the theological virtues, and I'm really excited to go into those as well. But this is such a good conversation on the cardinal virtues, and I feel like there are so many things that were brought up in today's episodes that honestly we could do like a full length episode just diving into, that one topic, but for the
Yeah.
sake of time, this is what we've got. And I've thoroughly enjoyed this.
I have
So
as well, and hopefully you guys have listening also. And if you have any thoughts that you want to share with us, we would love to hear them. So feel free to send us a DM over on our Instagram page, shoot us an
mhm.
email through the contact form on our website, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below. And we would love to hear your thoughts on the virtues that we've talked about today.
Amen to that.
So, to wrap things up for today, Cecilia, what have you been listening to this week?
I I've been listening to a bunch of different things, but one thing that I was listening to was George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, which is
Classic.
such a fun piece, such a fun piece. I absolutely love it. Um, it's so enjoyable and carefree. And I just, I was reading a bit about the history of it, because I was curious for whatever reason. And it was original. Well, I'm familiar with the orchestral version of
Hmm.
it, but originally it was actually, written for piano and jazz band as part of an experimental jazz concert,
Oh, wow.
uh, that I think Paul Whiteman put on, I want to say, in the 1920s, and basically convinced George Gershwin to write it because he published in the newspaper that George Gershwin was writing a piece for it. And George was like, oh, okay, I guess I actually have to do this now. Because he had said no before, thinking that
That's
there was.
hilarious.
I know, right? Isn't that so funny? So he
That is
wrote.
not ethical. Let's just be clear.
It's so not ethical, not virtuous, one
No.
might say. But we got Rhapsody in Blue out of it, and I really enjoyed that piece a lot. So it was originally for jazz band and piano, and one of the critics actually wrote that that Rhapsody in Blue made an honest woman out of jazz, which I think was really funny because jazz was pretty heavily criticized during the 1920s.
Yeah,
So, so according to one of the critics, Rhapsody in Blue made an honest woman out of jazz.
that is so
But I
funny.
personally prefer the orchestral version. I think it's a lot of fun, absolutely beautiful, so many colors, and it's just great. So,
Amazing. What a great answer.
what have you been listening to?
I have been listening to the Sound of Music
Oh,
soundtrack
I
recently.
love
Now, if you know anything about me, like in real life, I'm a Sound of Music fanatic. I,
that. I did forget about that. I
yeah,
did forget that.
and I have like I pride myself on having listened to like literally as many recordings of the Sound of Music as I could possibly get my hands on. Like everything from like, do you remember when NBC did like a live Sound of Music with Carrie Underwood? And it was
I
like live on
vaguely
TV,
remember
like
that. Vaguely, vaguely,
to
vaguely, though.
the like 50s, like the original 50s German film soundtracks and the original Broadway cast and then the Broadway revival in the 90s and like and everything in between. Like I love the Sound of Music. But on October 1st, it was Julie Andrews' birthday. And
Oh, no, that's cool. She was born on the Feast of Saint Therese.
she was born on the Feast of St. Therese. Also, Jimmy Carter's 100th birthday this year was also on October 1st. So
Oh my gosh.
that's kind of, yeah, big day all around.
Yeah.
um, But like Julie Andrews will always have a special place in my heart for her role in Sound of Music in particular, but also just for being an iconic queen, musical queen. She just, everything she touches is golden. She's so unproblematic as well. She just is a really like wholesome kind of person. And so because it was her birthday this week, I was listening back to a lot of the kind of Sound of Music tracks, and they just bring me so much joy, like the whole story. Anyway, I should like do a whole episode, maybe a bonus episode or something someday on the Sound of Music and the Trapp family singers, because I know so much about them. I have read their biography and some additional works of Maria von Trapp. I know a lot about them, and I'm very passionate about them and their family.
I'm supposed to go for it. I say do it.
Yeah, so maybe that'll be coming later in the season. Who knows? But yes, happy birthday, Julie Andrews. Everybody go listen to some Sound of Music.
I love that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
On that note, let's go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We had a joy discussing the cardinal virtues today, and we're so excited to return next week with our discussion on the theological virtues. Until then, God bless.
God bless. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Little Sparks podcast. For more information on this podcast and our ministry, please visit www.thehildegardcollective.com.